Jackson Mitchell had seen enough winters in Montana to know when the cold could kill. The wealthy rancher pulled his fur-lined coat tighter as he stepped off the train at Chicago's Union Station in December 1922. Snow whipped through the massive terminal, and passengers hurried past with their heads down, eager to escape the bitter wind that seemed to follow them inside. Jackson wasn't in Chicago for pleasure. His cattle empire had made him one of the wealthiest men in the West, but wealth meant nothing when family was involved. His sister Margaret had fallen ill, and he'd traveled halfway across the country to be at her bedside. The telegram in his pocket still crumpled from his anxious fingers during the long journey. As he made his way through the crowded station, something caught his eye that made him stop dead in his tracks. Huddled near a heating vent, three small figures sat pressed together like frightened animals. Two boys and a girl, none of them older than 10, wearing clothes so threadbare they might as well have been naked in this weather. Their lips were blue, their small bodies shaking violently, and their eyes held a hollow emptiness that Jackson recognized from his own childhood. The eldest boy, perhaps 8 years old, had his arms wrapped protectively around the younger two. His dark hair was matted with snow, and his shoes had holes so large that Jackson could see his bare feet through them. The girl, who couldn't have been more than 5, was crying silently, tears freezing on her cheeks before they could fall. Jackson approached slowly, not wanting to startle them. He'd grown up poor himself, back when Montana was still wild territory, and he knew the look of children who'd been abandoned by the world. His own father had died in a mining accident when Jackson was 12, leaving him and his mother to fend for themselves. Only luck and determination had pulled him out of that life. "Hey there," he said softly, crouching down to their level. The oldest boy immediately tensed, pulling his siblings closer. Jackson could see the defensive fear in his eyes, the same look Jackson had worn when strangers approached during his own hungry childhood. "It's all right," Jackson continued, keeping his voice gentle. "I'm not going to hurt you. What are your names?" The boy's voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from cold and exhaustion. "I'm Tommy. This is my sister Lucy and my brother Sam." Jackson nodded, his heart clenching at how small they seemed. "Where are your parents, Tommy?" The boy's face crumpled for just a moment before he forced it back into a mask of false bravery. They're coming back. They just want to get food. They told us to wait here." Jackson had heard those words before, had spoken them himself when he was young and desperate. He knew what they really meant. These children had been abandoned, left to freeze in one of the busiest train stations in America, while hundreds of people walked past them every hour. Rebecca Martinez had been working at Union Station for 3 years, and she'd seen plenty of heartbreak in that time. Families torn apart by poverty, children separated from parents, elderly people dying alone on benches while waiting for trains that would never come. But something about the scene unfolding near the heating vents made her pause in her duties. A well-dressed man in an expensive coat was kneeling beside three of the street children who'd been haunting the station for days. She'd noticed the kids herself, had even snuck them some food from her lunch when the station master wasn't looking. But this man was different. He wasn't shooing them away or calling for security. He was talking to them like they mattered. Rebecca had grown up in poverty herself, the daughter of Mexican immigrants who'd worked themselves to death trying to make a better life for their children. She recognized the look of desperation in those children's eyes, the same look she'd seen in her own mirror as a child. Working at the station had given her a steady income, but it had also shown her how cruel the world could be to those who had nothing. She watched as the man stood up and began removing his coat, the expensive fur-lined garment that probably cost more than she made in 6 months. Without hesitation, he wrapped it around the three children, pulling them close to share his warmth. "Sir," Rebecca found herself saying as she approached them, "are these your children?" The man looked up at her, and she was struck by the kindness in his eyes. "No, ma'am, but they're somebody's children, and they're freezing to death while we stand here talking." Rebecca felt her chest tighten. She'd been thinking the same thing for days, but hadn't known what to do about it. The station master had made it clear that vagrants weren't welcome, and she couldn't afford to lose her job. But seeing this stranger's immediate compassion made her ashamed of her own inaction. "I've seen them here for almost a week," she admitted. "I tried to help, but you're just one person," the man finished, understanding in his voice. "What's your name, miss?" "Rebecca Martinez. I work here at the station." "Jackson Mitchell," he replied, extending his hand. "And I think these children need more help than either of us can give them alone." Rebecca shook his hand, surprised by the firm grip and the genuine warmth in his expression. Most wealthy passengers treated station workers like furniture, barely acknowledging their existence. But Jackson Mitchell was different. He looked at her like she was a person worth knowing, worth respecting. "What do you think happened to them?" she asked, looking down at the children who were now sharing the warmth of his coat. Jackson's expression darkened. "Same thing that happens to thousands of children every year. Their parents either died, abandoned them, or couldn't afford to feed them anymore. So they end up here, hoping someone will care enough to help." Tommy looked up at the two adults talking above them, his young face etched with worry and exhaustion. He'd been taking care of Lucy and Sam for 6 days now, ever since their mother had told them to wait by the big clock while she went to find work. She'd promised to come back before dark, but dark had come and gone 6 times now, and there was still no sign of her. He'd managed to keep them alive by begging for scraps from passengers and finding warm places to sleep, but he knew they couldn't last much longer. Lucy had developed a terrible cough that shook her tiny frame, and Sam hadn't eaten anything in 2 days. Tommy himself felt weak and dizzy, but he couldn't let his fear show. He was the oldest, which meant he was responsible for keeping them safe. The man who'd given them his coat seemed different from the others who'd walked past them. He had kind eyes, and when he'd knelt down to talk to them, he'd looked directly at Tommy instead of through him. Most adults acted like street children were invisible, or worse, like they were dangerous criminals who might steal something if given the chance. "Are you really going to help us?" Tommy asked, his voice barely audible above the noise of the station. Jackson looked down at him, and Tommy saw something in the man's expression that he'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Real, genuine hope that things might actually get better. "Yes," Jackson said simply. "I'm going to help you, all of you." Lucy tugged on Tommy's sleeve, her small voice weak and scared. "Tommy, is the nice man going to take us to Mama?" Tommy felt his heart break all over again. He'd been hopping the same thing, but deep down, he knew their mother wasn't coming back. She'd left them just like their father had left them 2 years ago, just like everyone else had left them. Adults made promises they couldn't keep, and children like them paid the price. But something about Jackson Mitchell made Tommy want to believe again. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time, someone would actually keep their word. "I don't know, Lucy," Tommy whispered, pulling her closer, "but I think we're going to be okay." Jackson felt a familiar fire building in his chest as he looked at these 3 abandoned children. It was the same feeling he'd had when he'd built his first ranch, when he'd fought off cattle rustlers, when he'd stood up to corrupt officials who'd tried to steal his land. It was the feeling of righteous anger mixed with unshakable determination. These children deserved better than this. They deserved warmth, food, safety, and love. They deserved a chance to grow up and become whoever they were meant to be, instead of freezing to death in a train station while the world walked past them. "Rebecca," he said, turning to the station worker who'd stayed to help, "do you know if there are any orphanages in the city, places that might take them in?" Rebecca's expression grew troubled. "There are a few, but they're overcrowded, and some of them, well, let's just say these children might not be better off there than they are here." Jackson nodded grimly. He'd heard stories about orphanages, about children who disappeared into those institutions and came out broken if they came out at all. That wasn't good enough for Tommy, Lucy, and Sam. They'd already suffered enough. "Then we'll have to find another way," he said firmly. The station master, Harold Pemberton, had been watching the scene unfold from his office window with growing irritation. He'd told the cleaning staff repeatedly to remove the vagrant children who'd been camping in his station, but somehow they kept reappearing. Now some bleeding heart passenger was making a scene, probably getting ready to cause trouble about the poor homeless children like these people always did. Harold had worked his way up from nothing to become station master, and he'd done it by following rules and maintaining order. Union Station was a business, not a charity, and he couldn't have every beggar and vagrant in Chicago thinking they could set up camp in his terminal. It would drive away the paying customers, and then where would they all be? He straightened his tie and marched out of his office, his footsteps echoing authoritatively on the marble floor. The well-dressed man was still kneeling beside the children, and that Mexican girl from the cleaning staff was hovering nearby instead of doing her job. "Sir," Harold called out in his most official tone, "I'm going to have to ask you to move along. We don't allow loitering in the station." Jackson looked up at the approaching official, taking in the man's self-important expression, and the way he looked at the children like they were something distasteful he'd stepped in. Jackson had dealt with plenty of Harold Pembertons in his life, small men who used their tiny bit of authority to make themselves feel bigger by crushing those who couldn't fight back. "These children are freezing," Jackson said calmly, standing to his full height. He was several inches taller than Harold, and the station master took an involuntary step back. "That's not our problem," Harold replied, though his voice had lost some of its bluster. "This is a train station, not a shelter. If you don't have business here, you need to move along." "I have business here," Jackson said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "My business is making sure these children don't freeze to death while you stand there worried about your precious reputation." Harold's face reddened. "Now see here, sir. I don't know who you think you are, but—" "Jackson Mitchell," Jackson interrupted, extending his hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Owner of the Triple M Ranch in Montana. Perhaps you've heard of it." Harold's expression changed instantly. Even in Chicago, the Triple M Ranch was known. It was one of the largest cattle operations in the country, and Jackson Mitchell was rumored to be worth more than most small towns. Harold had never met real wealth before, and he suddenly found himself uncertain of how to proceed. "Mr. Mitchell," Harold stammered, his tone becoming obsequious, "I had no idea. Of course, if you're personally involved with these children, then perhaps we can make an exception." Jackson's smile grew colder. "How generous of you. Tell me, Mr. Pemberton, how many children have frozen to death in your station this winter?" The question hung in the air like a physical weight. Harold opened and closed his mouth several times, clearly struggling to find an answer that wouldn't make him look like a monster. We don't keep records of such things," he finally managed. "Of course you don't," Jackson replied, "because then you'd have to admit that you're letting children die on your watch." Dr. Elizabeth Harper had been making her rounds at Chicago General Hospital when the call came in. 3 children had been brought in suffering from exposure and malnutrition, and they needed immediate medical attention. As the hospital's head pediatrician, she'd seen plenty of cases like this, but they never got easier. What she hadn't expected was to find the children accompanied by a wealthy rancher and a train station employee, who both seemed genuinely invested in their welfare. Most of the street children who came through her doors were brought in by police or social workers, people who were just doing their jobs. But Jackson Mitchell and Rebecca Martinez clearly cared about these specific children as individuals. "How long have they been on their own?" Elizabeth asked as she examined Lucy, the youngest of the three. "At least a week," Rebecca answered. "I've been seeing them at the station for that long, but they might have been there longer before I noticed them." Elizabeth nodded, making notes on her chart. Lucy's breathing was labored, and she had all the signs of developing pneumonia. The little girl's body temperature was dangerously low, and she was severely dehydrated. Another day or two in the cold and she might not have survived. "She's very sick," Elizabeth said quietly to Jackson. "They all are. Malnutrition, exposure, dehydration. The youngest one has pneumonia, and the oldest boy is showing signs of frostbite on his feet." Jackson's hands clenched into fists. "But they'll recover." "With proper care, yes. But it's going to take time, and they'll need somewhere safe to stay while they heal." "They'll have somewhere safe," Jackson said firmly. "I'll make sure of it." Elizabeth studied his face, seeing the determination there. In her 15 years of practice, she'd met plenty of wealthy people who made grand promises about helping children, only to disappear once the immediate crisis was over. But something about Jackson Mitchell seemed different. There was a depth to his concern that went beyond temporary guilt or social obligation. "Mr. Mitchell," she said carefully, "these children have been through tremendous trauma. Even after they're physically healthy, they're going to need stability, consistency, and professional care. Are you prepared for that level of commitment?" Jackson looked over at Tommy, who was sitting beside his sister's bed holding her hand while she slept. The boy's eyes were fixed on Lucy's face, as if he could will her to get better through sheer determination. It was a look Jackson recognized from his own childhood, the desperate hope of someone who'd already lost too much. "Doctor," Jackson said quietly, "I grew up poor. I know what it's like to be hungry, to be cold, to wonder if anyone in the world gives a damn whether you live or die. I was lucky enough to find a way out of that life, and now I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. If I can't use that money to help 3 children who need it, then what's the point of having it?" Elizabeth felt something shift in her chest. In all her years of dealing with wealthy donors and philanthropists, she'd never heard anyone express it quite like that. Most of them talked about their charitable work like it was a hobby, something they did to feel good about themselves. But Jackson Mitchell sounded like he was talking about a moral obligation, a debt he owed to the universe. "All right," she said, extending her hand. "Let's talk about what these children are going to need." Tommy had been awake for 3 days straight, too afraid to sleep in case something happened to Lucy or Sam while he wasn't watching. The hospital bed was the softest thing he'd slept on in months, but he couldn't relax. Adults had disappointed him too many times before, and he wasn't going to let his guard down now, no matter how nice everyone seemed. The doctor lady had been kind, and the man who'd given them his coat had visited every day, bringing food and toys and books. But Tommy had learned not to trust kindness from strangers. It usually came with strings attached, and the strings always ended up being more than children like him could handle. "Tommy," Jackson said softly, pulling up a chair beside the bed, "how are you feeling?" Tommy shrugged, not taking his eyes off Lucy's sleeping form. "Okay, I guess. You know, you don't have to stay awake all the time. The nurses are here and I'm here. We're going to make sure nothing happens to your brother and sister." Tommy finally looked at him, and Jackson saw the exhaustion and fear in the boy's eyes. "You say that now, but what happens when you get tired of us? What happens when we're too much trouble?" The question hit Jackson like a physical blow. How many times had this 8-year-old boy been abandoned? How many adults had made promises they couldn't keep? How had the world failed these children so completely? "Tommy," Jackson said carefully, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to get tired of you, and you're not going to be too much trouble. Do you understand?" Tommy's lower lip trembled slightly. "Everyone says that, but then they leave." "I know," Jackson said gently, "but I'm not everyone. I'm going to prove that to you, even if it takes years. You and Lucy and Sam are going to be safe, and you're going to be loved, and you're going to have everything you need to grow up strong and healthy." For the first time since Jackson had met him, Tommy began to cry. Not the silent, controlled tears of a child trying to be brave, but the deep, shaking sobs of someone who'd been holding back too much pain for too long. Jackson reached out and pulled the boy into his arms, holding him while he cried for all the losses he'd endured, all the fear he'd carried, all the responsibility he'd shouldered at an age when he should have been worrying about nothing more serious than homework and playground games. "It's okay," Jackson whispered. "You don't have to be strong anymore. You don't have to take care of everyone. You get to be a kid now." Judge Margaret Whitmore had been presiding over family court for 12 years, and she'd seen every kind of case imaginable. Custody battles, adoption proceedings, abuse cases, neglect cases. But the case of Tommy, Lucy, and Sam Peterson was unusual in several ways. First, there was the matter of Jackson Mitchell himself. Wealthy men didn't usually show up in her courtroom wanting to adopt street children. They adopted bobbies from respectable families, children who came with clean histories and no complications. They didn't take on traumatized siblings with medical needs and behavioral issues. Second, there was the extensive documentation that Mitchell had provided. Medical records, psychological evaluations, financial statements, character references, and a detailed plan for the children's care that was more thorough than most she'd seen from professional agencies. The man had clearly done his homework. Third, there was the matter of the children themselves. In her experience, children who'd been through what these three had endured usually had significant attachment issues. They were often withdrawn, aggressive, or emotionally distant. But when she'd interviewed them, she'd found them to be remarkably well-adjusted for what they'd been through. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, looking over her glasses at the rancher sitting at the defendant's table, "you understand that adopting 3 children, particularly children who have experienced trauma, is a significant undertaking. Are you prepared for the challenges that may arise?" Jackson nodded. "Your Honor, I've spent the last 6 months working with these children and their doctors and therapists. I understand that this isn't going to be easy, and I'm prepared for whatever challenges come up. And you understand that this is a permanent commitment. These children will need stability and consistency, not just financial support." "Yes, ma'am. I'm not looking to be a benefactor or a guardian. I want to be their father." Judge Whitmore studied his face carefully. She developed a good sense over the years for people who were in court for the wrong reasons, and she couldn't detect any hidden motives in Jackson Mitchell. He seemed genuinely committed to these children's welfare. "Tommy," she said, turning to the oldest boy, "do you want Mr. Mitchell to be your father?" Tommy looked up at Jackson, then back at the judge. "Yes, ma'am. He kept his promises. He said he'd take care of us, and he did." "And Lucy, Sam, do you want to be part of Mr. Mitchell's family?" Both younger children nodded enthusiastically. Lucy had recovered from her pneumonia and was back to being the chatty, energetic 5-year-old she was meant to be. Sam had gained weight and lost the hollow look in his eyes that had haunted him when Jackson first found them. "Very well," Judge Whitmore said, signing the papers in front of her. "Mr. Mitchell, congratulations. You are now the legal father of Tommy, Lucy, and Sam Mitchell." The courtroom erupted in quiet celebration. Rebecca Martinez, who'd become like a surrogate aunt to the children, wiped tears from her eyes. Dr. Harper, who'd continued to monitor their health, smiled broadly. Even Harold Pemberton, the station master who'd initially tried to have them removed, had shown up to witness the adoption. But the biggest celebration came from the children themselves. Lucy launched herself into Jackson's arms, followed quickly by Sam. Tommy, who'd been reserved and cautious for so long, finally allowed himself to believe that this was real, that he really did have a family again. "Can we go home now, Dad?" Lucy asked, the word coming naturally to her lips. Jackson felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Yes, sweetheart, we can go home." The train ride back to Montana was nothing like the journey that had brought Jackson to Chicago 6 months earlier. Then, he'd been a worried brother rushing to his sister's bedside. Now, he was a father bringing his children home for the first time. Margaret had recovered from her illness and had been thrilled to learn about her new niece and nephews. She'd spent weeks preparing the ranch house for their arrival, setting up bedrooms and buying clothes and toys. She'd even hired a tutor to help get the children caught up on their education. Tommy sat pressed against the window, watching the landscape change from industrial Chicago to rolling farmland to the vast open spaces of the American West. He'd never seen anything like it, and his excitement was infectious. Lucy and Sam chattered constantly, asking questions about everything they saw. "Is that really our house?" Lucy asked in wonder as they approached the ranch. The main house was a sprawling log structure with a wraparound porch and smoke rising from several chimneys. It looked like something from a fairy tale. "It's really our house," Jackson confirmed, lifting her up so she could see better. "And those are our horses and our cattle and our land as far as you can see." Tommy stared at the scene with wide eyes. "All of this is ours." "All of this is ours," Jackson said. "And someday, if you want it, it'll be yours to run." The idea was too big for Tommy to fully comprehend. 6 months ago, he'd been a homeless child begging for scraps in a train station. Now he was the heir to one of the largest ranches in Montana. It felt like a dream that he might wake up from at any moment. But as they walked up the steps to the front porch, as Margaret opened the door with tears in her eyes and welcomed them home, as they sat down to their first family dinner around a table laden with more food than they'd seen in their entire lives, Tommy began to understand that this wasn't a dream. This was real. This was his life now. "Dad," he said quietly as Jackson tucked him into bed that first night, "thank you." Jackson looked down at his son, this brave boy who'd protected his siblings when the world had abandoned them, who'd shouldered responsibility no child should ever have to carry. "Thank you for trusting me, son. Thank you for giving me the chance to be your father." Tommy smiled, and for the first time in years he fell asleep without worrying about what tomorrow might bring. He was home, he was safe, and he was loved. That was enough. Years passed like pages in a book, each one bringing new adventures and challenges for the Mitchell family. Tommy grew into a responsible young man who had his father's determination and his own quiet strength. He excelled in school and showed a natural talent for ranching, often working alongside Jackson in the fields and with the cattle. Lucy blossomed into a spirited teenager with a love of books and a dream of becoming a teacher. She was determined to help other children the way she'd been helped, and she spent her summers volunteering at the local orphanage and teaching reading to younger children. Sam became the family's gentle giant, tall and broad-shouldered like his father, but with a tender heart that drew him to the animals on the ranch. He had a gift for healing injured creatures and talked constantly about becoming a veterinarian. Jackson watched his children grow with a pride that went deeper than anything he'd ever felt about his business success. They were good people, kind and hardworking and compassionate. They remembered where they'd come from, but they weren't defined by it. They were going to make the world better, each in their own way. The story of the Mitchell family had spread over the years, becoming something of a legend in Montana and beyond. Newspapers had written about the wealthy rancher who'd adopted 3 homeless children, and the story had inspired others to similar acts of kindness. But Jackson always insisted that he was the one who'd been blessed, not the children. "They saved me just as much as I saved them," he would tell reporters. "I thought I was successful because I had money and land, but I wasn't really successful until I learned how to be a father." On Christmas Eve, 1932, exactly 10 years after Jackson had first found them in the train station, the Mitchell family gathered around their tree for their annual tradition of sharing memories from the past year. It had become a way of acknowledging how far they'd come and how grateful they were for the life they'd built together. Tommy, now 18 and about to graduate from high school, stood up first. "I want to thank Dad for teaching me that being a man isn't about being tough or strong. It's about taking care of the people you love and standing up for what's right." Lucy, 16 and beautiful, spoke next. "I want to thank our family for showing me that love isn't something you have to earn. It's something you give freely, and it comes back to you multiplied." Sam, 14 and thoughtful, added his own words. "I want to thank everyone for teaching me that it's okay to be gentle. You don't have to be hard to be strong." Finally, Jackson stood up, looking at his 3 children with eyes that still misted when he thought about how close he'd come to losing them. "I want to thank God for bringing us together. I want to thank you 3 for making me a better man than I ever thought I could be. And I want to thank everyone who helped us along the way, because families aren't just made of blood. They're made of all the people who choose to love and support each other." Margaret, who'd been like a mother to the children all these years, raised her glass. "To the Mitchell family, to second chances and new beginnings, to the power of love to change everything." They drank their toast, and then they sat by the fire while Jackson told the story he told every Christmas Eve, the story of how they'd found each other. It was a story that had grown richer with each telling, not because the facts had changed, but because they understood more deeply what it meant. Tommy looked into the fire and thought about the scared 8-year-old boy he'd been, huddled in a train station and convinced that he'd never be safe again. That boy couldn't have imagined this life, this family, this love. But that boy's courage and determination had helped make this life possible. Lucy thought about the sick little girl she'd been, coughing and freezing and depending on her big brother to keep her alive. She'd been so scared then, but now she was brave and confident and ready to take on the world. She was going to be a teacher, and she was going to help other children find their way home. Sam thought about the quiet, withdrawn boy he'd been, too scared to speak up or ask for anything. Now he was surrounded by people who encouraged him to use his voice, who celebrated his gentleness instead of trying to toughen him up. He was going to be a veterinarian, and he was going to heal the wounded creatures of the world. Jackson thought about the man he'd been before he'd found them, successful but somehow empty, rich in money but poor in the things that really mattered. These three children had taught him about real wealth, about the kind of riches that couldn't be measured in dollars or acres. They'd made him rich in love, in purpose, in joy. The fire crackled, and the snow fell softly outside, and the Mitchell family sat together in the warmth of their home, surrounded by the love they'd built together. It was a love that had started with a simple act of kindness on a cold day in a train station, but it had grown into something that would last forever. Years later, when historians looked back on the early 20th century, they would note many things about the period. The technological advances, the social changes, the economic upheavals. But tucked away in their records would be the story of Jackson Mitchell and his three children, a story that proved that sometimes the most important moments in history aren't the ones that make headlines. Sometimes the most important moments are the ones where a single person decides to stop walking past injustice and do something about it. Sometimes the most important moments are the ones where someone with power chooses to use it to help someone without power. Sometimes the most important moments are the ones where a family is born out of love instead of blood. The Mitchell family had indeed made history, not because they'd conquered nations or invented new technologies, but because they'd shown that love could triumph over abandonment, that kindness could overcome cruelty, that hope could defeat despair. They'd shown that every child deserved a chance to be safe and loved and valued. Their story spread far beyond Montana, inspiring other wealthy individuals to open their hearts and homes to children in need. It led to changes in how society treated homeless children, improvements in social services, and a greater awareness of the responsibility that came with privilege. But perhaps most importantly, it reminded everyone who heard it that heroism wasn't just about grand gestures or dramatic rescues. Sometimes heroism was as simple as stopping to help when everyone else was walking past. Sometimes heroism was choosing to see children as valuable human beings instead of problems to be solved or removed. Jackson Mitchell had gone to Chicago as a worried brother and had come home as a father. Tommy, Lucy, and Sam had gone from homeless orphans to beloved children with unlimited futures. They'd all been transformed by the power of love, and through their transformation, they'd helped transform the world around them. The story of the millionaire cowboy who'd found 3 freezing children at a train station had become more than just a story. It had become a testament to the possibility of redemption, the power of second chances, and the truth that families weren't just born. They were chosen and built and nurtured with intention and love. In the end, Jackson Mitchell's greatest fortune wasn't measured in cattle or land or money. It was measured in the 3 children who called him Dad, in the love that filled his house, in the knowledge that he'd helped 3 young people find their way home. That was a wealth that would last forever, a legacy that would continue long after he was gone. The children he'd saved had grown up to save others in their own ways. Tommy became a successful rancher who employed dozens of people and treated them all with dignity and respect. Lucy became a teacher who touched hundreds of lives and helped countless children discover their own potential. Sam became a veterinarian who healed not just animals, but also the broken hearts of the people who loved them. And the story continued, passed down through generations, reminding everyone who heard it that love was the most powerful force in the universe, and that sometimes all it took to change the world was one person willing to stop and care about someone else's pain. The Mitchell family had found each other in the darkest of circumstances, and together they'd built something beautiful and lasting. They'd proven that miracles were real, that heroes walked among us, and that no child was ever truly forgotten as long as there were people willing to love them. Their story had indeed made history, not in the way that wars or inventions made history, but in the way that love always makes history, quietly, profoundly, and forever.